It's an intimidating pleasure to be here. I'll be talking about a two-system view of the mind, thinking fast and slow. And I'll be trying to talk about it while pulling your intuitions in. In a way, I'm lucky to be studying intuition because it's a topic that lends itself quite well to communication with people outside the field. We can use demonstrations, and we can use demonstrations, many demonstrations, very quickly without getting people to get up from their chairs. And this is true for visual perception. We have many demonstrations in visual perception, but it's also true for the kind of thinking that we call intuition. And today I'll be presenting material which I will sort of assume that all of you experience in the same way, or pretty much in the same way, see the same thing and think the same thing. And I even have an excuse in case I fail, which I'll explain my excuse later. So this is an example of a visual effect that all of you are familiar with. This is called an echo cube, and it changes orientation. And the point about its changing orientation, which is something that happens spontaneously, you see it in two forms, is that the change is coherent and immediate. That is, there are two basic stable perceptions of the Necker cube. They're both three-dimensional, and you alternate between one and the other, and all the lines that we see have different roles in the two figures, and they switch from one role to another together. And this principle of coherence is a principle that applies to intuition as well. This is another form of coherence. It's a famous example. If we ask people to associate one of these forms with the sound maluma and the other with the sound takiti, there is 100% agreement on how this is to be done. So there is some coherence between the sight and the sound. There is some sense of fit between the sight and the sound. Very much the same thing happens in the context of thinking and intuition. And here is another famous visual illusion. This one might take a minute or two for you to see. There are actually two ways of seeing this. This is called, I think, the daughter and the mother-in-law. You can see a rather pretty young woman or a really ugly old woman, and you switch from one to the other. And the point about that one is that at any one time you see one of them. You do not really at any one time see both of them. You know there are both of them there. That is, you are aware of the possibility of seeing that figure in two ways. But at any one time, you can very precisely identify how you see it, whether it's the old woman that you see or her daughter-in-law. So I will speak of two types of mental activities, and to experience the distinction, it's actually quite straightforward. If I say 2 plus 2, you experience one of those types of mental activity. And if I say 17 times 24, you experience the other. So let's go very quickly over what's involved in those two. When I say 2 plus 2, something happens to you. That is, a number comes to mind. And you didn't ask for it. You didn't have to decide to perform the computation. There is nothing voluntary about it. It is delivered to you by your memory, and it happens automatically. And this word automatic is really the key to it. And the distinction between automatic and what I call controlled has been a topic of psychological investigation for some 40 years, and we are beginning to understand it fairly well. What happens to you when you hear 17 times 24 is much more complicated. In the first place, the solution doesn't occur to you. The solution is 408, but it doesn't happen to you in the same way that 2 plus 2, that 4 comes with 2 plus 2. You're aware that this is a multiplication problem. You are probably aware of whether you could do it in your head. You decided not to do it. That is, you had a chance of whether to do it or not, and you decided that it wasn't worth it. And it's a different type of thing. Here, you're in charge. The subjective experience is that you are the author of these actions and these decisions. This is not something that's happening to you. This is something you do. So I call those two sometimes type 1 and type 2, but mostly I suggest that these two types of thinking, the fast one and the slow one, are respectively produced by two systems, and that's a pure metaphor, and I will apologize for that metaphor later. I call them System 1 and System 2. Now, System 1 is the fast, effortless, automatic one. System 2 is slower and effortful, and it involves the control of attention. Now, System 1 is not only involved in generating simple associations, and System 2 is not only involved in complex computations. My argument will be that most of our mental life really is System 1. Most of our mental life is automatic. It's delivered to us by memory, and we are, in a certain sense, not the authors of it. We are the observers of it. So let me give you an example of a few of the things that System 1 is involved in. Of course, I said 2 plus 2. If I say the capital of Russia, something happens to you which is retrieved automatically from memory. And System 1, in my thinking, is identified very closely with what psychologists also call associative memory. You recognize a friend. A lot happens to you, actually. It's not only that you have the label, the name for the friend, but many associations have been activated. You're not fully aware of them in the sense that, it's not one long story. Telling all these associations would be virtually impossible. But a great deal happens at once when you see that friend. Another thing that happens to you, if you see your friend and he looks sad or tired, you will become aware of some search for an explanation of why he is sad and tired. That involves going back over what's been happening to him recently, what's been happening in his life. And that search for causal explanations is very much part of automatic fast thinking. Now, it used to be thought classically that associations were linear. The word table brings the word chair, white brings black. That is really not the way the associative system works. The associative system works, and it's more like throwing a pebble onto a pond. It ripples across the pond, and many things happen at once. Many ideas are activated at once. So if I mention, say, the notion of the current problems between China and Japan, now, you're not ready to give a full lecture on the problems between China and Japan, but many words have become more accessible to you. Many ideas have become more accessible to you. So that if, for example, somebody were to whisper words, you would be quite likely to hear the word Navy. You would be quite likely to hear the word war. There were many words have become more accessible, many ideas have become more accessible when I just mentioned China and Japan and their current problems. So that is the beauty of this associative system. It responds very, very quickly to events, to mentions of ideas, and it responds in a very broad way by a broad activation, simultaneous activation of many ideas and actually, in many cases, quite a few emotions. So when I say that your mother, something happens to you because something happens to every one of us when we think of our mothers, there is an emotional response. It could vary. It could be simple. It could be complex. It could be very positive. It could be sadder. Almost certainly something happened to your face when I mentioned the word mother, which was compatible with the emotion that was evoked. So all these are instances of fast thinking, but they're not the only kinds of fast thinking. Skilled behavior is fast thinking. So what happens to us when we drive a car is fast thinking. It is automatic. That is, we can drive a car and maintain a conversation and barely be aware of the fact that we're driving. This is something that happens. This is true so long as we don't have a problem on the road. When you're making a left turn into traffic or overtaking a car on a narrow road, System 2 takes over. You are mobilized, you are paying attention. It is no longer automatic. And interestingly enough, when you're making a left turn into traffic, you will stop talking. You certainly should stop talking. So that's what happened there. Now, notice about driving that it wasn't always System 1. When we learned to drive, it was System 2. And one of the main principles of fast thinking is that slow thinking with considerable practice and adequate feedback becomes automatic. And whole routines of action become automatic. A master chess player, after, so it is said, about 10,000 hours of practice at the board, learns to see the board very differently from how most of us see it. And for the master chess player, all the moves that occurred to him or her when seeing a new position, all the moves are strong. So something very radical. This is not something that happens to us novices or duffers. This is for masters. It takes a lot of practice. It takes practice in a regular world and with fairly immediate and high quality feedback, and then skill develops. And skill, including intuitive skill, belongs to System 1. All of us have skills that are at least equivalent to those of the chess players in many domains. So we admire chess players because they have skills that few of us have, but we admire them too much in a sense, because we all can do many, many things that are nearly as complicated. You know, I always bring the example that one of my skills is knowing my wife's mood from one word on the telephone. It's a skill that all of us married people have, and we have acquired it in the same way that we learn to drive, with a lot of practice and fairly immediate feedback about. So I'm speaking of associative memory, and I want to say a few things about how associative memory works. When we interpret stimuli, I said that the role of associative memory is to produce interpretations of what is going on, and to produce those interpretations rapidly and accurately, if possible. One of the most impressive aspects of this associative memory is the way that we use context. And the use of context, you know, one very common and famous example is the sentence, "Anne approached the bank." This sentence may not have appeared ambiguous to you because you interpreted the bank, most of you, except those who have been fishing recently. You interpret it as an institution that has money in it and tellers in it. But there is a completely different interpretation of exactly the same sentence, and that's the interpretation you would choose if the context had been fishing. So if the context had been fishing and approached the bank means something entirely different. Now, we're not really aware of this ambiguity. The ambiguity is suppressed, as in the example of the wife and mother-in-law. We see one interpretation at a time, and it's rare that we see both, and the process by which one of these is inhibited is actually quite an interesting process. The role of context is incredibly powerful and very, very quick. My favorite example, which I think I told it in the Sackler lecture here last year, but I'll repeat it. It's a personal experience of mine with a phenomenon that is called priming, which is really the way that contexts work in determining your interpretation. And in that personal experience, my wife Anne, who is here and is a member of the Academy, and we had dinner with friends. And, later we engaged in regular pillow talk, and my wife said about the man in that couple, he is sexy, which is okay. So this is what she said. And the next thing that she said was utterly bewildering to me, because she said the following sentence: he doesn't undress the maid himself. He doesn't undress the maid himself. I had a lot of trouble with that. This just didn't seem to make any sense at all. And I was puzzled, where did that come from? And I tried to interpret it. This is work for system 2, this is effortful thinking. What could she mean? And then it turned out that what she had actually said was, he doesn't underestimate himself. But in the context of that one word, sexy, I was primed. It all happened in my head, but this shows you how context works. It's a whole interpretation, because a whole set of ideas had been activated by that single word. So this is one of the ways that the mind works, by producing those interpretations very quickly and in terms of priming. Here again, by the way, we're not aware of alternatives. The one thought that didn't occur to me, which should have occurred to me, is she couldn't be saying this. I must be hearing it wrong. Although I know I have hearing problems, that didn't occur to me. I knew this is what she said, and my only problem was, why would she say a thing like that? So that is very common and very typical in terms of the way that we live in the world. We believe what we see. We believe that what we see corresponds to a state of the world. Our associative memory is also absolutely superb at gathering world knowledge and bringing to bear on an interpretation. And there are many experiments that show this, but actually my favorite, and I have it in the book and I tell it everywhere, is of an experiment in which people were listening to sentences while their brain images were taken of their brain activity, and they listened to a voice, an upper-class British male voice, which I will not attempt to imitate, saying, "I have large tattoos all down my back." And you probably are aware of what is happening. Within about 1/3 of a second, there was a characteristic response of the brain, the signature of a response of surprise. And if you stop to think of it, this is pretty amazing as an achievement, because in order for this to happen, you had to identify, something had to identify in the brain, in memory, identify the voice as an upper-class British male voice, bring up the stereotypes of upper-class British males, notice somehow that having large tattoos all down their back is not part of the stereotype of this category of people. Noticing the incongruity, surprise is the answer, and an immediate mobilization of system 2. That is, an immediate mobilization of more effortful thinking to try to make sense of what just happened. So, let me talk a bit about system 2, and first let me show an example from visual perception. Now, these two lines are obviously different, but all of you have seen the illusion that this is an illusion, and you know I could draw vertical lines and show you that the lines of the two horizontals, or the length of the two horizontals, are actually strictly identical. So you know that what you see is wrong. There is that interesting separation between seeing and believing. Normally, we believe what we see. but we don't always believe what we see. It is possible not to believe what we see, although actually, with difficulty. We're barely capable of doing that. We continue seeing the two lines as different, even though we know that they are the same. And there are many examples of this in the domain of intuition, as well as in the domain of visual perception. Let me describe a puzzle that plays a fairly big role these days in cognitive psychology, or in some parts of cognitive psychology. And the puzzle is this. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Some of you, this is a select audience, some of you know the answer, and not all of you will have felt what I'm confidently going to say most people feel. I think that in the mind of most everybody, a number came to mind immediately after the puzzle, and the number was 10 cents. It's designed that way. It is designed to evoke 10 cents. Now, 10 cents is the wrong answer. It's very easy to find out. If the ball actually costs 10 cents, then the bat costs $1.10, then the total is $1.20. So that's not the correct answer. The correct answer is 5 cents. But what is interesting about this puzzle is that about 50% of Harvard students fail it. That is about 50%, and it's not much better at MIT, the best was Princeton, and they were not very good. So what is happening, and we know something really quite interesting about the people who write 10 cents when that question appears in their questionnaire. They haven't checked, because if they had checked, they would not have written that down. They're all capable of figuring out the answer. But what happened to them, and this I'm going to suggest is what happens most of the time in our intuitive thinking. A number came to mind. It came with high confidence. It was delivered, like memory delivers 2 plus 2 equals, like memory delivers 4. It delivered 10 cents. They trusted their intuition, and there they went. There are, by the way, interesting differences between the people who write 10 cents and the people who check. And there are also people who are so skilled in problems of that kind that they immediately, very quickly, suppress the intuitive answer and go on to produce the correct answer. So system 2 is involved in computations, but it is also involved in checking. It is involved in inhibiting responses. So, the characteristic of system 2 is that it's effortful. The activities are effortful. There are physiological manifestations of it, including a speeding of heart rate, the pupil dilates, and there are many, many other changes, in addition to the inability to do something at the same time. So whenever you've had the impulse to tell somebody to go to hell, and you haven't told that person to go to hell, system 2 was involved in that inhibition, and that inhibition is effortful, and actually there is evidence that it may be tiring. It's tiring not to tell people what you think about them, and it's depleting, as we now say. So what's the relationship between system 1 and system 2, and what is their role in our mental lives and in the way we think about the world? And what I would like to suggest is that actually most of the work is done by system 1, and system 2 is in a strange relationship. And here is another metaphor in this talk that's rich in metaphors. Here is another one. I think of the two systems as a newspaper room. And in the newspaper room, you have a lot of reporters, and they're writing stories. And you have an editor. And the editor is overworked. And the editor, in my story, is quite lazy. That is, he does as little as possible. And he gets all those stories. But all the stories, except very few that go directly to the printer, and that's in case of national emergencies, all the stories go through him. He's got to endorse a story before it goes to the printer. Normally, the overworked and lazy editor will endorse the stories. Most of what we believe originated in System 1. Now, the editor will defend his opinions, so if you ask for why did you do this, or why did that appear in the paper, the editor will find reasons to explain the decision, but ultimately, it really came from System 1, and the editor endorsed it. Now, sometimes the editor can stop it, can inhibit the response, can generate, pass it on to another reporter, block it altogether, like in the example of Going to Hell. But in that view of the mind, the allocation of responsibilities between System 1 and System 2 is, I think, profoundly different from the way that it is in our subjective experience of our mind. Because in our subjective experience of our mind, we are mostly identified with System 2. Because System 2 is what we're aware of when we're paying attention. What happens automatically, we see only the output of. We do not really see the process, whereas when it's a voluntary process, we are far more aware of it. And in general, the role of System 2, in my sort of view of the mind, is that in many instances, it provides us rationalizations for products, intuitive products of System 1. So we don't like somebody, and System 2 tells us why. But why we don't like that person was generated somewhere else, was generated by an automatic process, and then we are left looking for reasons which may be correct or may not be correct. This dominance of System 1 over System 2 and the role of System 1 in our beliefs and in our opinions is something that I went on at some length when I spoke here, gave the Sackler lecture on communicating science to the public. And this is that in general, we think we have beliefs because we have reasons for those beliefs, but that is really not the way it typically works. The way it typically works is we have beliefs, and then we develop the reasons. It is not that we have beliefs because we had the reasons. We're inclined to believe arguments that support positions that we already have. And what is created here is a sort of coherence, the same kind of coherence as between Maluma and Takiti. Things fit very well, and that fit is what System 2 characteristically produces. So, to appreciate the way that this system works that generates coherent interpretations of the world, there is a phenomenon that psychologists talk a lot about that's called the halo effect. And this is basically that when you have an emotional reaction to somebody or to something, you tend to see just about everything as emotionally consistent with your basic response. So, and that creates major distortions in the way that we see people. So in a famous, quite a very good book actually, titled The Halo Effect, that deals with the business literature, the author Philip Rosenzweig points out how CEOs are just judged in the business press when their firm is doing well and when their firm is doing poorly. And we're completely unaware of doing that. But a CEO is firm or when his firm is doing well, and stubborn when the firm is doing poorly. And we're absolutely unaware of that switch, which is really caused by, it's not that the CEO is causing what happens to the firm, it's our view of the CEO is inseparable from our view of the firm. And it's emotionally tends to be inseparable. People have different attitudes to the president. If you like the president politics, I would submit you'll probably like his voice. And if you don't like the president politics, you probably are quite aware of the fact that he has very large ears. And, you know, those are the things that happen. That's the kind of emotional coherence that tends to be produced automatically by what I call System 1. And System 1, oops, I've been going the wrong way here. And because of this coherence-producing activity of System 1, we tend to live in a world that is basically much simpler than the real world. Because, as in the case of the mother and the daughter-in-law, competing interpretations tend to be suppressed. We see a world that is relatively simple. We see a world that makes sense, and that makes causal sense. There are fewer complexities and fewer contradictions than in a more realistic view of the world. Now, let me say a few things about how System 1 solves problems. And one of the very remarkable things, actually, when you think about our cognition, is how rarely we are stumped. We have opinions about everything. And we have opinions about things we have no business having opinions about. And where do those opinions come from? Why is it that we're so rarely stumped? And here I have a very simple answer. And the answer is that, you know, how do we answer a hard question? Well, it's by answering an easier one instead. That is, very commonly, when we are stumped, or when we ought to be stumped by a hard question, we do something else happens, which is an answer to a more natural question. Here's, I think, a visual example of that. Whoops, yeah. What's the size of the figures on the screen? That's a powerful and very familiar illusion. In this context, the figure on the right just appears larger than the figure on the left, even when you're trying to judge their size on the screen. If I strip the background away, you would see that the three figures are actually identical. Now, you're not confused about what the question is. You know that the question was about the size on the screen, and we know when we present that figure to people on the page, they report the sizes of the figures in inches, not in feet, so they're not talking about real people. They're talking about the people that they see on the page. What happens? What happens is that in this context, another question, or the answer to another question, thrusts itself in front of the answer to the question we're trying to answer. In the three-dimensional world that we naturally see in this context, the figure on the right is taller than the figure on the left. And this is what we're going to be seeing. Here is something, from a survey of people at universities. They're asked two questions. And in one of the questions asks, how happy are you? And the other question asks, how many dates did you have last month? Okay. Now, there are two versions to this survey. In one of the versions, the question about dating comes first, the question about happiness comes first, and the question about dating comes second. In that case, the correlation is about 0, actually. There are, although it might surprise some of us, there are other things on the minds of undergraduates but dating, so that they're not really answering the question about happiness in terms of the question of dating. But if you invert the order, so you first ask, how many dates did you have last month? And then, how happy are you? Then all of a sudden the correlation between these two questions is, as perfect as correlations get in psychology, which is not very high, but is quite high. What's happening is very clear in this case. I'm asked a hard question, how happy am I? I don't have an immediate answer to the question. But I have a question to a much simpler, I have the answer to a much simpler question, which is, how do I feel now? And if I just been reminded that I've had many dates last month, I feel a lot better than if I've been reminded that I had a lonely month. And so this is the way that we answer so many questions. We don't really answer the question, how happy are you? You answer the question, what's your mood now, given that you were just asked how happy are you with your, indirectly, how happy are you with your romantic life? This is something that we do all the time. We answer hard questions by answering easier ones, and we're not aware of it. So in one of my favorite examples, it's a study that was done about 20 years ago when there was terrorism in Europe and people were selling travel insurance in airports. And the experiment, which tried to simulate this, offered people two policies and asked them for how much they were willing to pay for each of those two policies. And one of the policies paid $100,000 for death, in case of death for any reason in the course of your trip. The other policy paid $100,000 in case of death in a terrorist incident during your trip. And basically, the object of the experiment was to measure how much each of these policies is worth. And you have guessed it, the second policy is worth much more than the first. Now, this, of course, doesn't make any sense logically because, but we're not talking logic here. What we're talking about is an instance of substitution. Figuring out how much I'm willing to pay for insurance is extremely difficult. But figuring out how much I'm afraid of the loss described in the insurance policy, that is very straightforward. And people are much more afraid of dying in a terrorist incident than they're afraid of dying. And there is no contradiction here. This is really something that happens in our memory directly. Now, let me give you an example that illustrates several things at once, and I hope that I have you with me enough so that you'll see what is happening to your mind as I raise the question. We're talking about Julie, who is a graduating senior at the university, and I'm going to tell you just one fact about Julie. I'm going to tell you that she read fluently when she was age 4. And I'm asking you, what is her GPA? And the very striking thing is, I don't want to dare to run the experiment here, but I think it couldn't work here differently from other places. A number comes to mind. That's a mystery. I mean, a range. It's not strictly a number, but it's a range. It's a fairly narrow range. You know, it's less than 3.9. It's more than 3.4. It's somewhere, you know, it's somewhere in the B+ range probably, or A-. What happens? Well, what happens, and this is the way that the intuitive system works in this instance, what happens is this. When I say Julie read fluently at age 4, something happens automatically in system 1. You have a judgment of intensity. You have a judgment of precocity. You have mapped this onto a dimension that is an intellectual dimension. The dimension on which you map it has something to do with a question sometimes. So you have that. And then, what is the number that comes to your mind? The number that comes to your mind, if you had a percentile for Julie's precocity, the number that comes to your mind for a GPA corresponds very closely to the same percentile on your subjective distribution of GPA. That's the way it works. It's a very complicated computation. We have the goods on that. I mean, we know experimentally that this is exactly what happens. And if you think about the complexity of it, it is enormous. But if you think about it, you will also see that it produces a statistical absurdity. And it's absurd to match the percentiles. You ought to predict much more regressively. Anybody here who knows statistics will know about regression to the mean. This is the epitome of non-regressive prediction. We are given information, we match our prediction to the information we were given. That happens automatically. That is the way that System 1 works. System 1 altogether has an extremely complex and difficult relationship with statistics. Basically, it can't do it. And there are, I think, deep perceptual reasons for why System 1 is so bad at statistics. Let me show you. Here is a question that you can see the answer to. You present that display of lines, and there is experimental evidence that an average size for those lines is generated actually automatically. People can generate it when they're busy doing something else. I think that's research that my wife did and other people have done. No question about it. Now, let me show you a question to which you don't have an answer. What's the total length of the lines? So notice that fast thinking, the perceptual system in this case, computes one type of answer. It extracts an average from an array, and it doesn't compute another answer. It doesn't compute the sum. And it turns out there are some like variables. There are variables that are like sums, and there are variables that are like averages. And in intuitive thinking, the same rule applies. We're very sensitive to averages and very poor at computing sums. Let me give you an example. People were given a scenario many years ago, actually, in connection with the Exxon Valdez case. People were asked how much they would be willing to pay to save migrating birds from drowning in oil ponds. It turns out there is a problem that migrating birds mistake oil ponds for water ponds, they alight in it, and they drown. And, it's a horrible image. And now, how are people going to deal with this? Well, they were asked, different groups of people were asked how much they would pay to save different quantities of birds. And they basically gave the same answer for 2,000 birds, for 20,000 birds, for 200,000 birds. So what is it that they're paying for? They're not paying, they're extracting an average. They're paying to save a bird. They're paying to save a generic bird. This is exactly the same thing. What comes naturally to us when we're given that scenario, and you may have had the visual image, those of you who engage in visual imagery, the image of a bird, feathers full of oil, drowning. That's what we want to prevent. The numbers are completely incidental to it. We've got to multiply, we've got to stop ourselves. We've got to do something else. So one response came intuitively. The other response, if you are going to generate a different one, you will have to do it by System 2. Now, most of the time, we are not aware that we need to involve System 2. So when we get that impression about how much we're willing to pay, well, that's how much we pay. So, it's a longer story than the story that I have told you, but I've tried to give you a sense for how fast thinking works. And fast thinking, or System 1, works very much according to principles that have parallels in the way that the perceptual system works. It deals with individuals, it deals with causes, it doesn't do much with statistics or ensembles, and it produces a coherent and simplified image of the world. Thank you.